Without further ado, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, the fire ant.
Thank you. It is so amazing to be here and having a chance to listen to all of you, to feel the energy in this room. It is absolutely palpable. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this amazing journey that you are all on. So thank you. I'm so excited and humbled and honored to be with you. Thank you.
The only person more excited and humbled is myself, because as you can see, I've taken a few notes along in reading her book. And I wanted to start, you open your book with a chapter entitled How I Got My Name. Now, in our schools across our network, we begin with a Who Am I project. And I found, from a doctor and a scientist, this book has this incredible interweaving of your personal and family and community story. And so I wondered, I think there's a picture of you with your mother and your family, and I wonder, why is it so important? How do you think about your personal and your professional work together?
Hear me? You can hear me?
Great.
So there's me when I was a baby with my mom. I was born in Sheffield, England, to Iraqi immigrants. We came to England for a short time. My father was doing his studies there, and the plan was to go back to Baghdad, where we're from. All of our family was in Iraq. It was just a couple years we were going to be there, and then we were going to go back home to the Middle East, Iraq. Arabic was my first language. And then this was the late 1970s, and Saddam Hussein came in power. Do you guys remember Saddam Hussein? Like big bad guy in Iraq. We went to war for like several decades against that country. So my parents realized that we couldn't go back home. And we immigrated to the United States. So I was not born here. I will show you my birth certificate. So we came to Michigan when I was about 4 or 5 years old. We came fleeing dictatorship, fleeing oppression, fleeing tyranny, and we came here for what every immigrant comes to this country for freedom and democracy and opportunity and the American dream. And that was, absolutely realized for me and my family. So when I started to write this book, which is a book about kind of what happened in Flint, people are like, I thought this was just going to be a Flint book. I thought it was going to be about the science and you being a doctor and taking care of kids and the research and the backlash. What is this stuff about where you're from? And there's Arabic words in here and Arabic food and stories about your grandfather and your great uncle and all these Arabic things in here. Why is it in this book? And as much as I set out to try and write a book just about what happened in Flint, it was impossible to separate that from who I am. Because to understand what I do and why I do what I do, you have to know who I am and where I came from. And who I am is And who I am is very much an immigrant who very much sees the world through that lens. I see the world through this lens of being somebody who is every day grateful to be in this country. I pinch myself, and I'm so lucky to be here because my cousins, stayed back home and, went through many, many wars and growing up in an oppressive regime. And I wake up fortunate that I am here. But it is also through that lens, that immigrant lens, that I have this kind of almost heightened antenna for what injustice is because of acutely knowing how injustice can be and how people in power can really take advantage of vulnerable populations. So it is through that lens of an immigrant that I was raised to serve my community, no matter where my community really ended up. And my community ended up in being Flint. And that was not an accident. It was definitely kind of through that lens of being an immigrant, having those roots in social justice, that pushed me to medicine and pushed me to be in a community that needed me.
Thank you. And as you describe where you're coming from, we've got many students here, and I wonder if we could take you back a little bit. Many people get a little uncomfortable thinking about their high school years, but I think you had some pretty powerful, informative experiences there. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of your own environmental activism. Is there something called SEE, I think, students, and And I think you were also in drama, because you've had some dramatic moments as well, right?
So often I speak and people are like, wow, you're a doctor. Like you know how to talk in front of people. Like we didn't think doctors really knew how to speak. And they're like, how have you become a good speaker? And I sincerely credit my days in high school in the drama club, which made me comfortable on a stage, which made me comfortable projecting and making eye contact. So take advantage of those many, many, many opportunities like drama. But my time in high school was foundational, and it absolutely set my career trajectory. I started high school young, so remember I was an immigrant, I came to this country, and in most of the world, you write birth dates differently, so I was born December 9th, but in Europe where I was born, it was written 9/12 instead of 12/9, so when I came to the States, everybody thought my birthday was September instead of December, so I got to skip a grade of school, which was awesome. So I started high school, and I also got to celebrate 2 birthdays. So I started high school when I was 13, and like I said, I was raised in this milieu of social justice. My parents never shielded us from what was happening back home. I acutely remember as a kid, I think I was 11 or 12, my father showed me a picture of a dead baby, which was the massacre in Hanna-Attisha in northern Iraq, where Saddam Hussein poisoned and gassed an entire village of his own people. 5,000 people died that day. So they tried to purposely not raise me in a bubble and made me aware of the injustices that were happening both at home, back home, but also here in my new home. And when I started high school, I had an incredible mentor, and you guys, I've heard you already talk about mentors and how we are moved and motivated and inspired by our mentors. And I had a mentor named Roberta, who was the librarian at the high school, and she also advised our environmental group. It was a brand new club at the high school called Students for Environmental Awareness, also known as SEE. And we did the things that environmental clubs do, like we recycled bottles, and we put on environmental plays for elementary schools, and I was always like Mother Earth in these plays. It was really funny. And so, but then we found out that in our adjacent city, which is right here in Metro Detroit, there was a city called Madison Heights. There was an incinerator. An incinerator burns trash. And in that neighborhood, kids in that neighborhood had higher rates of asthma. Adults had higher breathing problems. When people woke up in the morning, there was a layer of black soot, along their cars and in the grass. This was also a poor neighborhood, so not unlike most environmental issues. And so my mentor, my advisor, the leader of this group in high school, she took a risk, and she took us out of the classroom and into the community.
We're okay with that. I think we're okay with that risk.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I remember I was 13, I couldn't drive. My parents would drop us off at these community organizing meetings or protests, and they'd be like, and no cell phones back then, and they'd be like, good luck, don't get arrested, we'll pick you up in 2 hours. So began to work hand in hand with the community, with an organization called Clean Air Please, which was led by a single mom nurse who was just so determined. And we door knocked, and we put on rallies, and we wrote letters. And it was that early age that I realized the power of my voice, that I had an incredible voice, no matter how small I was and still very vertically challenged, but no matter how young I was, no matter who I was, that I had power and I had a voice, and people sometimes listened to me more than they listened to the bigger people. We eventually, in our little community group, worked to elect a state representative who was part of our organization. The very first thing that he did when he went to the state legislature in Lansing, here in Michigan, was passed a law that you can't have an incinerator open so close to an elementary school. It was literally in the backyard of an elementary school. And that incinerator shut down 20 years ago, and it never reopened. And so at that very, very early high school age, I learned the power of my voice. I learned the power of activism. I learned the power of community organizing. I learned the power of being a partner in community. I learned also the power of policymakers and how good policymakers and good policies can protect people. So what I did has been in high school was so foundational and really almost like serendipity for my future career.
I hear about that serendipity. It sounds like the opportunity for that was created as well. And as you're listing off the set of skills that you picked up there, I see them directly translated into the work you're doing. In addition to that set of skills and the sort of the what, I was also struck by, it seems that the who you know is very important as well. And I think we've got a shot here of you back in high school. Whoops, no, not that one. That's a little bit earlier. Yeah. There we are. And so, this is looking back to your former self, but I think the person in this picture is not only a high school friend. That who you know turned out to be quite important later on.
Yeah, so this picture is from my freshman year of high school at a Greenpeace rally. There's an Earth flag attached to my pink bike. You see my 10-speed bike right there. And this is a classmate from high school. Her name is Elin. She also was motivated from those very early experiences in environmental activism. She went on to be an environmental engineer, and then she went on to work at the Environmental Protection Agency in their Office of Drinking Water. And she's had a long career in drinking water protection. A few years ago, she left DC, she came back home to the Detroit area, and in late August of 2015, I invited her over, last minute, texted her. I'm like, hey, Elin, what are you doing? Why don't you come over, bring the kids, our kids can play together for our last minute, barbecue, or just come over, let's just hang out. We haven't connected in a while, you're back in town. And she's like, oh, I'm free, sure, I'll come over. And we're hanging out, our kids are yelling and screaming like what little kids do, and we're having a glass of wine and just, relaxing. My husband's barbecuing, and she corners me in my kitchen. And this is a girl I've known for 20 plus years who I trust. She was the valedictorian of our high school. She's super genius. I was the class president, had continued to be a leader and an activist. But we've always been super, super close. And she's like, Mona, you're in Flint, right? I'm like, yeah, I work in Flint. She's like, well, have you heard about the water in Flint? And I'm like, yeah, the residents are saying there's problems with the water, with the color and the odor and the taste, and we had bacteria issues, but the state says everything's okay, and the federal government's saying everything's okay, and all their scientists are saying everything's okay. So I've been telling my patients that everything is okay, because how can our drinking water not be okay? When you turn on your tap in Flint and Detroit or wherever you are, how can our water not be okay? It's America. It's the richest country in the history of the world. It's the 21st century. How can our water not be okay? And in my kitchen, from my high school friend, who went on, like I said, also formed by those high school experiences, it was then that she told me that the water wasn't being treated properly, that she had seen a memo from a former EPA colleague of hers that she trusted. And in that memo, it said that the water wasn't being treated properly, and because of that, there would be lead in the water. And it was that moment in my kitchen with my high school girlfriend that literally changed the trajectory of my life, but also changed the entire trajectory of the city.
Wow. Yeah, that's fantastic. So to big picture students, whether they're other students that you meet in your school or here at this conference, think about those connections and those relationships, and it may be that 5, 10, 20, 30 years later, you'll be recircling back to create some really catalytic change.
Hold on to your friends, hold on to your networks. I think the biggest lesson of my story is the need for building a team, because my story in this book is not about one person. It is about people who came together and people who couldn't have been more different than each other. I used to think that as a pediatrician, we pretty much have a monopoly on taking care of kids. There's nobody else who cares about kids, maybe teachers, more than pediatricians. And throughout this whole experience, I learned that there are so many other folks that care for kids even more than we care for kids. So do engineers, and so do teachers, and journalists, and social workers, and moms, and pastors, and different folks. So hold on to all those diverse folks who work and live in different disciplines and who are different than you, because you need them around you for your village and your network.
Picking up on that, you mentioned the connection and overlap between pediatricians and teachers. Are there things that as these educators are going back to their community that you think we should make sure you're partnering with the folks in public health and medicine? What are some ways that they could be really active in that way?
I love teachers. Like, there are no closer allies to pediatricians than teachers. What you guys are doing every single day is the exact same work that we do as pediatricians. So much of my job as a pediatrician is to care for that child in front of me, be it the fever or the broken bone or the well baby visit. But everything that we do as pediatricians is not as much about the kid today, but it's about the promise of that child. It is about where are they going to be in 5 years and 10 years and 15 years? Are they going to be healthy? Is their development going to be successful? And that is no different than what you do in education. Our work is the same because it is all about the tomorrows of these children and what they will become, and protecting and fulfilling and inspiring and nurturing those brains and those bodies. So I think what we have learned, especially in places like Flint and in other underserved areas, is that we have to kind of be cognizant of all these other factors that impact the education and the health of our children, and they're the same thing. So we have to be aware of and responsive to the bigger issues like poverty and violence and lack of nutrition, and incarcerated parents and poor, and unsafe places to play. All of these things we know have a greater impact on the lives of children than any antibiotic that I can prescribe. So being able to holistically treat children and to buffer them and protect them and make sure they have a great education is as critical to any one of our disciplines.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm picking up on a few pieces there. I think you're mentioning young people and the way in which we need to care for them systemically, and that it goes beyond what's in a classroom or just in a doctor's office, or these sort of underlying conditions. I think many people now, when they hear the word Flint, immediately pops up of the water crisis. But there's also a long history and tradition of young people being involved and engaged in activism in Flint. And I think that's the picture that was flashed there for a moment. And so I know you referenced the work of Janora Johnson-Dollinger. And so could you tell folks a little bit about what are the ways in which there's this tradition here in this area?
So a long time ago, do you guys know what Flint was famous for before the water crisis? I think I heard it, cars. So you're in the Motor City right now, right? You're in Detroit. But cars were actually born in Flint. So General Motors was born in Flint, and before they were making cars in Flint, they were making carriages, so horse-drawn carriages, and that quickly began to be the production of cars. So over a century ago, cars were born in Flint, but even more importantly than the birth of cars, Flint is really known for the birthplace of prosperity, of the middle class, and arguably the American dream. So shortly after cars were being made and kind of spit off the lot, workers in Flint did something totally illegal, totally radical, totally disobedient, totally resistant. And
we're okay with some of those things.
Yeah,
as well.
It's totally good. And they said, hey, we want a fair share of this prosperity. Like, we're not being protected. Like, our fingers are getting cut off and we're not getting benefits. We're working overtime. If we're making red cars, we're coughing up red that day. So they began to get organized. And in the 1930s, they did something that was never done before. They held something called the sit-down strikes. And people call this the strike that was heard around the world. For 44 days, auto workers literally sat down and occupied all the car plants in Flint. And they demanded those better wages, they demanded better working conditions, and they demanded a fair share of that prosperity. General Motors tried to beat them up. They tried to freeze them out. It was January, and I'm so glad you're not here in the winter in Michigan, but it was cold. They cut off the heat. They tried to cut off their food supply, and the workers persisted, and they resisted. And these are the children of the workers. And if you look at their signs, it's like better food, better life. Our dads will win. And a couple of those kids, including the baby in the front, is the child of one of the most important organizers of those Flint sit-down strikes. and it wasn't a guy, it was a girl, and her name was Janora Dollinger Johnson, and she was an absolute badass. She was only like 20 years old, and she was one of the key strategists and organizers for this entire massive radical disobedient movement. And they won, and nobody expected them to win, and they won. Finally, the National Guard was called in, which was the last time the National Guard was called in before our water crisis. And President Roosevelt intervened, and our governor at the time of Michigan, his name was Frank Murphy, who was my absolute favorite governor, and they intervened to protect the workers. The National Guard was sent in to protect them. And their union, the UAW, was born. And for the very first time, they had access to things like living wages and housing and health care and benefits. And people all over the world, immigrants all over the world, came to Flint for a chance at that prosperity. African Americans in the Great Migration North, fleeing Jim Crow, came to Flint for great living wage jobs. And at one point, and it's so hard to believe, Flint had the highest per capita income in the country. Now, not even that long ago, 1970s, the people of Flint made the most money in the entire world because of the action of those disobedient, young, radical organizers who saw a better future ahead of them and knew that they could make it happen, they believed, including the children. So that's this incredible, loyal, resistant history that Flint has that is still part of the present day. That same spirit was alive in Flint throughout our water crisis. We had incredible organizers who were loud and resistant, who teamed up, who also were part of this team that helped uncover the crisis, but also move us into recovery. We also have a shout out to our current youth in Flint. So all of the work that I presently do, I run this public health initiative that kind of leads the recovery in Flint. All of the work that we do is hand in hand with community partners, and this is what I learned back in high school. You work together with people, shoulder to shoulder, humbly working with a community that you are privileged to serve. So we have a group of parents. It has to be our work. We have a group of parents that are partners to our work, but we actually also have a group of kids. And in the spirit of being kind of community-driven, they've named themselves. They're the Flint Youth Justice League. So another group
They wear capes, I'm assuming.
They actually, one of them drew their logo, which is, they're all superheroes, with all different superhero powers. And one of our Flint Youth Justice League members is a little girl. She's now 12. Her name is Mari Kopany, also known as Little Miss Flint, who is the most amazing organizer in our city. She has done more in our city than most adults. She brought President Obama to Flint. Right now, she is leading an initiative to get the presidential candidates to do a youth-driven town hall. She's already gotten most of the 20-plus presidential candidates agreed. Cory Booker agreed yesterday to be part of her youth town hall. She has raised thousands of money. She has become a national leader in terms of empowerment and what kids can do. And so it's really hard because I have to like close my mouth and make sure that our kids raise their voices, and not only raise their voices, but that we sit and listen. And that is kind of implicit to all of our work, is being driven by what kids have to say.
Thank you for that. I think we'll be doing that shortly. So we're going to move into a Q&A in just a little bit. And I think hearing you describe the history and tradition of the spirit of badassness that caused me to go read more into Janora Johnson Dollinger. I picked up a copy of her book. For whichever student or alumni asks the first question, we'll provide you that book as well. All right.
She's amazing. She spent then her whole life fighting for justice with the ACLU and human rights issue and anti-war issues. She was an incredible, incredible woman.
So I heard you saying persistence and resistance and resilience. I was struck by, you wrote that resilience isn't something you're born with. It isn't a trait that you have or don't have, it's learned. And I think far too often in conversations about communities such as Flint that face significant challenges, there's this focus on post-traumatic stress disorder. And I wonder, you seem to be describing that there might be this post-traumatic resilience. And so I'm wondering, what are the things that you think educators, health workers, community folks can do that might create more of that resilience out of there?
Yeah, and I think you're doing it already, and it's starting to be done. So the story of what happened in Flint is so much a story of what happens when we ignore science. So like basic common sense science was denied, which is, we see that today. Give me like 2 big examples right now of science denial. Climate change, what else? Vaccines, good. So 2 big, and also all the issues with just fact denial right now that we're in. So Flint is a story of what happens when we like disrespect and ignore science and what the consequences can be. Flint is also a story of the power of science and scientists and facts to speak truth to power and to expose these things. And then now in our recovery, we are leaning on amazing science, the science of child development and brain plasticity and early adversity and toxic stress and trauma and resilience in our recovery. So we have framed this entire crisis in Flint, which is more than just about lead exposure. It was a population-wide trauma. Every single person in Flint was betrayed by every governmental agency that was supposed to protect them. They were lied to. There was cover-up. People died. And that in and of itself is a trauma. And there are raw feelings of anger and fear and betrayal and guilt and anxiety. And just those feelings can lead to poor outcomes. And this trauma of the crisis is on top of a city that was already rattled with trauma. We talked about the heyday of Flint having the highest per capita income in the country. Shortly after that, because of man-made policy choices, Flint has really suffered from decades of disinvestment, loss of manufacturing, population loss, racist policies like blockbusting and redlining, lack of regionalization, crumbling schools, you name it. So much so that a child in Flint actually has a life expectancy 15 years less than a child in an adjacent neighboring zip code because of their zip code of birth. And that's not unique to Flint. That is throughout our country, where the environment and the situations of where we grow up have the greatest predictor on how we end up. So this trauma of the crisis was on top of so much trauma that the city has already been through. So we put it kind of under this lens of what do you do when you're exposed to trauma? You do something called trauma-informed care. You build resilience. You use the science of child development and brain plasticity and whatever you can to not only build strong children, but strong families and strong communities. So that's kind of the model that we've been practicing, that very science-based model that isn't just in medicine and health, but also in education. Our school system in Flint is very much kind of recognizing the need for like restorative practices and to be trauma-informed also in education practices. Really practicing that philosophy of not what's wrong with you, but like what happened to you and how can we support you because of these traumas.
Thank you for framing that out. I think as you describe that the science of it is not just the technical data, but actually there is power and importance in the stories that people are living every day out in that world and in those communities. I wonder, so in our work at Big Picture Learning, we're seeking to activate the power of students and schools and systems through real world connected, interest-driven learning. And yesterday, we went out into the Detroit community, and I was reading in your book that you, as the head of pediatrics residency, require all of the doctors to leave the hospital, go out into the community, spend time understanding the assets and the challenge. And I guess I wonder, someone might say, wait a minute, they need to be back in the hospital in some room carefully practicing their scalpel technique or how to measure certain data. Why do you think it's even okay for people to go out and leave where they are in the hospital to wander around in the community?
I think that is summed up by a poem that I have in my book. It's called A Worker's Speech to a Doctor. And it's a poem written in 1938, and it's a poem that I require all of my pediatric learners and medical students to read as well. And this is how it goes. When we're sick, we hear, "You are the one who will heal us." When we come to you, our rags are torn off, and you tap around our naked bodies. As to the cause of our sickness, a glance at our rags would tell you more. It is the same cause that wears out our bodies and our clothes. So that was written in 1938. We've come a long way since 1938, but in some respects, very little has changed. Like I said, the environments, the situations of where our children grow up, the air, the dirt, the stress, the violence, the hopelessness, in Flint's case, the water, can still predict our outcomes. So that is why it is important for our practice and what we do to leave the medical setting. Medicine does not equal health. In this country, we have it backwards. We spend so much money on health care, on when you are sick, like millions and millions of doctors when you are sick and need to be hospitalized, but we fail to spend the money on what we need to do to keep you healthy, like investing in public health and better environmental regulations and early childhood services and maternity care or maternal parental leave policies and breastfeeding support services and safe neighborhoods. And these are the things that keep people healthy. What we do in medicine is after they've gotten sick, by and large. So it's a different mindset that we need to understand. It's a recognition that there's all these other factors that play an incredible role in the lives of children that we need to be aware of and that we need to also leverage. So I also teach my trainees and my pediatricians that it's our role to be advocates. Unfortunately, kids can't vote, but I think you guys should change that. I think we should lower the voting age.
Yes, sir.
You guys need to vote. At least, I think it's being talked about in like DC and some other areas. I think Tacoma Park, Maryland, but like it should at least be 16, like if you can drive. But that's another story. But we need to be kind of more receptive to kind of what makes children healthy and their outcomes rather than being too late.
Thank you. Hearing that, I will be completely transparent with what we are trying to do here. We would love nothing more than to create legions and swarms of Dr. Monas in schools across the Big Picture Learning Network. That's what we're trying to do.
You can do it. You can absolutely do it. And like, I'm going to go back to high school because when I was in high school, people told me, you can change the world. You can do it. Like, you can change the world. And people were like, what do you want to do when you grow up? I'm like, I'm going to save the world. I'm going to change the world. And like, maybe I was naive, but throughout my training and my education, I was blessed with mentors and teachers who told me and gave me the skills and the toolboxes to put into place the ability to change the world. You can. And please know that you all can absolutely change the world.
And I will say, it's such a privilege to get to hear directly from your story. As I read the words in this book, they just jump off the page, and I'd encourage that the reason we're providing everyone at the conference with a copy of the book is we hope you'll go back to the school, we hope that you'll read it with each other, we hope that you'll lead book groups, that you'll integrate it into your advisory, and that will catalyze all sorts of change. I will also tell you that this is a gripping page turner, and you will get to the end, and I think you'll say, so then what happened? And like, what's the sequel? Tell me about, can I binge watch the next series? And so I guess, can you tell us, this book is published a little while ago, give us an update. What is the current status in Flint? What should people know, and how can they be of help and support?
Yeah, so I'll just say, so on the front of the paperback, there's a quote by Oprah magazine that said it had the gripping intrigue of a Grisham thriller. So like that was the intent. There's a lot of science and like medicine, but it's written for everybody. It's written for everybody to understand what happened in Flint, to understand the crisis, to understand the power of being an incredible resistor and team player, but also to understand what it means to then kind of turn away from that anger and to create hope in communities. And that's where we are now in Flint. So the hardest part about writing this book is to figure out how to end the book, because this is an ongoing story. The crisis is not over. Flint is still on bottled water and filtered water. And that's because our pipes are being replaced. So for 18 months, we had super corrosive water that wasn't being treated properly. That ate up the pipes that were delivering our drinking water. So now we are almost done with this massive infrastructure project of replacing our lead pipes, which is awesome. We never should have been using a neurotoxin to deliver our drinking water, like not a good idea. And because of that earth-moving infrastructure work, people are still on those precautions to drink filtered and bottled water. So that's where we are in terms of the water. There's precautions in place, but that will be done this year. And Flint will only be the third city in the country that has replaced their lead pipes. But now, because of Flint, many more cities are investing and mandating that lead pipes be replaced because listening to science. So that's where we are in the water. But I have this amazing privilege of spending my every day with Flint kids to make sure that they do not experience the consequences of this population-wide trauma. We can't take it away. There's no magic pill. There's no cure. There's no antidote. But there is so much that we can do and that we have put in place to mitigate the impact. And that's what we call these prescriptions of hope that we have built. For example, we have 2 brand new child care centers, high quality year-round free child care, also a poverty mitigator. Huge investment in home visiting programs and early intervention and school-based health services. Communities, relaunching of community schools, which was born in Flint in the 1930s, Medicaid expansion, trauma-informed care, mental health services. The list goes on of the hope and the resilience that has been built and created and has been led by Flint and often by our Flint kids. I'm going to share kind of my favorite thing that we've done, and that's because I'm a reader and a writer, and it has been around books, not big books, but children's books. So in places like Flint and in many of our underserved communities, there's about 1 children's book for every 300 kids. So think about 1 children's book for every 300 kids, and research shows by the time a lot of our kids turn 3 years old, they've heard about 30 million less words. By kindergarten, there's achievement gaps that are impossible, almost impossible to bridge. So we've had a huge effort around early literacy. Like how do we bolster not only the number of books, but really a culture of early reading. So we are now part of something called Imagination Library, which is run by the Dolly Parton Foundation. Like Dolly, who knew? Dolly's awesome. So every kid in Flint now gets a book mailed to them every single month from the ages 0 to 5. 100,000 books have been mailed to Flint kids, which is amazing. We also started something called Born to Read, supported by the NBA. Love the basketball players, the NBA Players Association specifically. So every baby born at the hospital gets a bundle of books and gets signed up for programs, children's books. About 2,000 babies have been part of that program. We've also launched something called Reach Out and Read, which is another evidence-based literacy program. My publisher, Penguin Random House, donated 5,000 children's books. So we have changed the trajectory, especially in early literacy, and we're hoping in our kind of academic evaluator hats that we're going to impact things like kindergarten readiness and 3rd grade reading and high school graduation rates. And this is one of the many things that we're trying to put into place that should have been in place already, that should be in place for all children. And that's part of the hope that we are trying to build, to really try to serve as a model for the nation, because this book is not and my story is not about Flint. My story is really about the Flints that are everywhere, about children everywhere who wake up to the same nightmare as Flint kids, the nightmares of poverty and injustice and austerity and lost democracy, the same nightmares where your zip codes are greater predictors than genetic codes. And so what we are hoping to do is export what we are doing to really mandate that kids everywhere have those same opportunities, those same interventions that we know promotes the health and the development of children everywhere.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mona. We're going to head out. I know there's a number of folks who have been eager to ask some questions, and I'm going to pose a last quick one to you. Well, if you can just signal and raise your hand, we'll be running a mic around to you. What you just described, you have this incredible tenacity, and you're able to continue to focus on Flint. I think in one way we celebrate this victory that has been won, but I also hear you saying there's this ongoing struggle. We're still sort of muddling forward to try to get there. And I guess what I wonder is, with each day, there's these new outrages and indignities. We heard about a school district in Pennsylvania that if young people weren't paying their lunch money, the district was going to report them to put their children into foster care, right? we hear about new water crises emerging in Highland Park, right here, in other places. And so I wonder, how do you, in the midst of the long arc of the work, how do you manage to stay strong, to stay focused, and what can people do to keep that fire?
Yeah, so the story of Flint has had so many ripple effects, be it from drinking water issues or infrastructure issues or environmental injustice issues nationally. And like I said, it's not an isolated story. There's issues throughout this country, and if you just turn on the news, it makes us, sometimes I think we're at war with children, be it our inaction on climate change or gun violence or cutting regulations that we know hurt our environment and our kids. Kids in the border in cages, separated from their parents, and constant threats to programs kids need, like WIC and SNAP and Medicaid, and the list goes on and on of how our policies and our country make us almost child-phobic rather than child-centric. And that needs to change. That is not right. That's not sustainable. That's selfish. That does not preserve the future of this country nor this planet. So I think we need to call it out when we see it, and that's been part of kind of my ongoing work is, and kind of what the title of the book is all about. So it's what the eyes don't see. So it has many meanings. Like you don't see lead in water, you don't see the effects of lead, but it is largely about people and places and problems that we choose not to see. But the obligation and very much our civic and human responsibility to open our eyes, and it's not enough to be awake, but really to act when we see injustices in our own backyard. So that's what keeps me going, is that throughout the country, I get to hang out with kids and people like you who are awake, who know what's going on, who are powerful, and who inspire me. And that's what happens when I'm in Flint. When I'm in Flint and when I'm with kids in Flint, they are like my Energizer bunnies. They keep me going. They inspire me. And not only because as a physician, I literally took an oath to protect kids, but implicit in this story and in our work and in your work is that we all took an oath to protect kids. Physician, teacher, whatever we do, we all have to stand up and speak up and fight for children.
Thank you. With that, let's go to some of the voices of those young people, and I think we have a first question.
Much bless you for your work. So I'm on the school board, and we deal with these assets of facilities. We have very old schools.
Everywhere.
And so could you talk a little bit about that? Because I have a school in my district and actually we had to test throughout our whole district, and so there was many schools, but it's very expensive to do that infrastructure work. So just, what it is, and I'm just wondering if you could help activate any of us to think about, is it a national bond? Are districts doing more work around facilities and not ignoring that piece?
Yeah, so one of the ripple effects of Flint is that school district after school district throughout our nation has been testing and finding lead in water. Because of that, there's been 3 national reports that have recently came out. One from the GAO, which is the Government Accountability Office, which is a branch of the federal government, that has also looked at this national issue of lead in water and pretty much has reaffirmed that it's a national issue. There's lead in water throughout. And yet there are 0 regulations that protect children in schools or child care facilities. There are 0 regulations, and because of that, the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is my professional body, has set forth some recommendations which recognizes the science that there's no safe level of lead and have put forth an action level of 1 part per billion. That's where we should be governed, because everything to date in the federal law at the EPA is not health-based. It's in support of the utilities. So that says where we should be. But schools have very limited resources. Their infrastructure is old. A lot of schools don't want to test because they don't want to find out because they have no money to do anything about it. So how do we fix this? How do we put dollars into the resources to protect children because they're going to school to learn, yet they potentially can be exposed to something that is doing the exact opposite of learning. So what I feel needs to to happen. And what I've been seeing throughout the nation is because of the inaction at the federal level, so right now there really is federal inaction on policies to strengthen these regulations, we're seeing creativity at the local level. San Diego School District just passed a bond for infrastructure work to address lead and water issues. Some things are being done.
We have some San Diego folks right here. So, yep.
Awesome. And that was like a citywide bond that was part of the last election. Other school districts are going to their other municipal government, for example, their county levels of government. A county right north of here, Oakland County, just passed, their county commission just passed some dollars to put filtration station in all of their schools. So they're creative solutions which are local and being kind of led by individuals. We need a national strategy. There are some bills in Congress led by actually Flint's Congressman Kildee, that is, and I think co-sponsored by Kamala Harris, that are looking at federal dollars specifically going to schools. But why do schools have to beg for these resources, not only for infrastructure, when I don't think the Department of Defense is begging for any resources? So we also have to change our values as a nation. Where do we want our taxpayer dollars to go to protect children?
Thank you. I think we have another question. Yep, right back there, yeah.
As it applies to the Flint Water crisis and other crises we see across the country, how do we fight misinformation?
How do we fight misinformation? You all have to be well-informed. You have to all remain inquisitive. You have to ask for more information. Like I said, for 18 months, I was also misinformed, and I was sharing that misinformation on with my patients because I was getting information from people I trusted. I don't trust anybody anymore. So I always ask for more information, for more questions, share it with people. I do trust people. Share it with like scientists and other people that I do trust, and try to get things triple fact checked. It's hard because the misinformation is also coming from folks who have a lot of resources and have a lot of tools to disseminate that misinformation that make it look very honest and truthful. I just finished reading a book called The Triumph of Doubt, which is about folks who spread misinformation and create doubt in science. And there's industries and firms that they're called product defense firms, like big tobacco and asbestos and PFAS companies and 3M and chemical companies. They hire them to spit out misinformation, pretty much saying that, oh, this is safe, this chemical, this poison is safe, the science is wrong, the scientists don't know what they're talking about. Here's other research articles we can share for you. So we have to dig deep. We have to find out who's funding these people. And it's harder now because there's a lot of dark money in policy and politics that are hard to trace back. But we have to keep our eyes open. We have to keep our eyes open and really always have that healthy dose of mistrust to remain skeptical, to remain doubtful about what we are hearing.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one last question. I saw some folks running with the mic. Right up here up front. Yeah.
Is it on? Okay. Hi, my name is Layla. My question is, what was the hardest part about starting to make this change?
What was the hardest part about starting to make this change? It was all really hard. So I was going against everything. I was going against the entire state. I was going against the federal government. It was a risk to my job, my reputation, my family. That was all really hard. I stopped sleeping. I couldn't eat. I lost like 20 pounds. My heart rate, because I could check my heart rate. But I'd also gotten a Fitbit before all this, so I knew my heart rate. It was close to 200. I couldn't sleep. I was like physically shaking. It was hard. It was physically, emotionally, and psychologically hard. But you know what? It didn't matter that it was hard because it was the right thing to do. And the right thing to do in life is not always and is very unlikely to be the easiest thing to do in life. So you have to take those risks. When you know something is right, when you have to step out of those boxes, when it's a risk to your family or career, whatever, you have to do what is right. And that's how I was raised by my family, by our kind of set of social justice values. And I think that's how all of you have been kind of raised and trained as well. So it doesn't matter if it's hard or easy. It matters if it's right. And then we need you. We need your voice.
Well, I'm not sure what Dr. Mona is running for, but I'm ready. Dr. Mona for president, perhaps? Can we give a round of applause?
I wasn't born here. I can't run for president. I wasn't born here.
We can change that. We can change that law. Do want to say thank you to Dr. Mona, and we'll pass on a variety of limited edition big picture swag.
The shirt's awesome. I love the shirt.
We wanted to find a way, though, to really express to you the appreciation we have and how you're inspiring our folks. And I think if we can show the next slide, we just have some incredibly talented folks from across the Big Picture Network. In particular, there's an artist out at the Met Sacramento High School who's created these incredible portraits of the different activists who we celebrate and think are really incredible and inspiring. And I do want you to notice that there's a missing portrait there in the bottom left. And so I wanted to see if we could add you to our pantheon. So I have right over here,
OMG.
we're adding Dr. Mona to that list.
With the glasses. Oh, that is amazing.
And I think the quote that's on here from Dr. Mona's book says, "We studied activism by becoming activists," is her quote. So thanks so much to Dr. Mona for that.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. I am humbled and honored and once again inspired by all of you and everything you're doing. And when I look out, I see a future that is so, so bright. Thank you. Thank you.
I want to let you know, if you would like to have your book signed by Dr. Mona, she'll be available in the atrium right out here on the left afterwards. You can perhaps take a picture of her with her larger-than-life self. Also, there are posters from yesterday, from Elliot's talk, that are available up here, additional copies of the book on the way out. Please make sure that you make it to advisory that is starting at like now. So drop by if you're going to get your book signed. Dr. Mona will be with us, and make sure you're back in time for the closing. Ladies and gentlemen, happy Big Bang. A warm round of applause for Dr. Mona.